He laughed while she was still on the floor, glasses shattered, knee bleeding because he knew no one would stop him. Then the man at the next table stood up, said his name out loud, and the entire room went dead silent. That's when the rich teen realized this wasn't a joke anymore. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. He laughed while she was still on the floor, glasses shattered, knee bleeding because he knew no one would stop him. Then the man at the next table stood up, said his name out loud, and the entire room went dead silent. That's when the rich teen realized this wasn't a joke anymore. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The restaurant had earned its reputation not through excellence, but through consistency. Polished wood tables that caught the warm glow of pendant lights, leather booths worn smooth by years of wealthy patrons, and soft jazz that played just loud enough to fill the silence without demanding attention. The walls were decorated with tasteful black and white photographs of the city's skyline, back when it was still finding its identity. Everything here was designed to feel timeless, expensive, comfortable. A place where money didn't need to announce itself, because it was already understood. The floor gleamed under regular maintenance, but beneath that shine lay the same unspoken hierarchy that governed every interaction within these walls. Customers who tipped well received faster service. Complaints from expensive suits traveled upward to management. Complaints from staff traveled nowhere at all. The air carried the mingled scent of seared steaks, butter-soaked lobster, and wine that cost more per glass than most people made in a day. This was a place built on appearances, where discomfort was meant to stay hidden and civility was a performance everyone had agreed to maintain. The rhythm here never changed. Waitstaff moved like shadows between tables, anticipating needs before they were spoken. The kitchen operated with mechanical precision. Glasses clinked softly. Conversations hummed at a controlled volume. Even laughter was expected to remain refined, measured, appropriate. Time moved differently in places like this, not forward, but in careful circles that kept everything exactly as it had always been. People came here because they knew what to expect. Predictability was part of the luxury. She had learned to navigate this world without leaving fingerprints. Isabella Harris moved through the restaurant with practiced invisibility. Her uniform, a blue and white ensemble that somehow managed to look both professional and diminishing, pressed and spotless, despite 6 hours of constant movement. Her dark hair, highlighted with warm caramel tones, was pulled back neatly, framing a face that had learned to hold pleasant neutrality the way others held weapons. Her hands knew the weight of every tray, the balance required to carry 3 entrees and 4 drinks without spilling a drop. Her body had memorized the narrow spaces between tables, the angles needed to avoid brushing against customers who might complain about being touched. The ache in her lower back had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, so had the tightness in her calves, the burning in the arches of her feet, and the way her shoulders had started to curve slightly forward from years of carrying weight they weren't designed to hold. She'd developed a pattern of breathing that kept exhaustion at bay, shallow enough not to be noticed, deep enough to keep moving. Survival here meant understanding that you were seen only when convenient, and blamed for everything when you weren't. Isabella had not always moved this carefully through rooms where she didn't belong. Once, she'd believed that hard work and decency would eventually be rewarded, that people with power would recognize effort when they saw it. The restaurant had taught her otherwise, one shift at a time, until staying quiet became easier than hoping things might change. She'd learned which customers wanted conversation and which wanted silence. She'd learned to recognize the difference between a genuine smile and one that preceded a complaint. She'd learned that "I'm sorry" was a survival tool, deployed automatically, regardless of fault, because taking blame was faster than defending yourself. Most importantly, she'd learned that the restaurant wasn't really about food, it was about maintaining an illusion, and her job wasn't to serve meals. It was to be invisible until needed, then disappear again before she became inconvenient. The evening shift was always the hardest. Morning customers came in tired, left quickly, tipped predictably. Lunch customers were distracted, rushed, transactional. But evening customers arrived with expectations. They came to be seen, to feel important, to exercise the kind of casual authority that money provided. They lingered over wine. They sent dishes back for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature or taste. They snapped fingers when they wanted attention and looked through you when they didn't. Isabella had learned to read the room before stepping into it. Tonight, the energy felt familiar: businessmen celebrating deals at corner tables, couples on obligatory date nights trying to remember why they'd chosen each other, and scattered individuals dining alone with phones or newspapers as companions. The usual Friday evening crowd, predictable, manageable. Then the door opened, and the restaurant's carefully maintained equilibrium shifted. 3 young men entered with the kind of confidence that didn't ask for permission. They were dressed expensively but carelessly, designer jackets worn open, shirts untucked deliberately, sneakers that cost more than Isabella's monthly rent. The one in front wore a dark jacket over a gray shirt, his white sneakers still pristine despite the wet streets outside. His face carried the particular smugness of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. Behind him, his friends followed with matching expressions of casual entitlement. Derek Murray didn't walk into rooms, he claimed them. The hostess, Jenny, greeted them with practiced brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Isabella watched from across the dining room as Jenny led them to a booth near the center, exactly where Derek had probably insisted, where he could be seen by everyone and see everyone in return. The kind of table that wasn't about privacy. It was about presence. They slid into the booth with loud ease, their laughter already pitched higher than necessary. Derek stretched his arms across the back of the seat, surveying the restaurant like he owned it. One of his friends, shorter, stocky, wearing an identical expression of bored amusement, flagged down the nearest server immediately. Snapping his fingers twice, Isabella felt her jaw tighten instinctively, then forced it to relax. She'd seen this before. Boys, because that's what they were, regardless of their age or bank accounts, who treated restaurants like their personal playgrounds and staff like entertainment. They'd order too much, eat too little, complain about nothing, and leave a tip that was simultaneously generous and insulting because it came with the expectation of gratitude for their mere presence. She turned back to her own section, balancing a tray of drinks destined for table 7. The restaurant continued its familiar rhythm around her. Silverware clinked against china. Quiet conversations rose and fell like gentle waves. The kitchen doors swung open and closed with mechanical regularity. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. Isabella didn't notice the man in the black suit seated alone at the booth directly beside where Derek and his friends had settled. Didn't notice the way he sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the table. Didn't notice how his eyes tracked every movement in the room, with the kind of awareness that came from years of knowing exactly when to watch and when to act. Kevin Minella noticed everything, and he had just started paying attention. Derek Murray had never learned to lower his voice because he'd never needed to. His laughter cut through the restaurant's carefully maintained ambiance like a knife through silk, sharp, deliberate, and entirely unconcerned with the disruption it caused. He leaned back in the booth, one arm draped casually over the leather backing, the other reaching for the glass of whiskey that had appeared within 60 seconds of his arrival. Speed like that didn't happen by accident. It happened because the staff had already been warned by the hostess. VIP table. Don't make them wait. This place is dead tonight, Derek announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. His voice carried the particular drawl of someone who'd grown up being listened to, whether or not he had anything worth saying. Thought you said this spot was supposed to be exclusive, Tyler. The stocky friend to his right, Tyler, shrugged, scrolling through his phone with his free hand while the other gripped an imported beer that cost $18. It is exclusive. That's why it's boring. Old money comes here to feel young. Young money comes here to feel respectable. He glanced up with a smirk. We come here because my dad owns part of it. The third member of their group, leaner and quieter but wearing the same expression of casual superiority, raised his glass in mock salute. To nepotism, Derek echoed, grinning as their glasses clinked together with more force than necessary. The sound made an elderly woman at the adjacent table flinch slightly. She glanced over, her expression hovering between disapproval and uncertainty, then returned to her meal without saying anything. Derek noticed. He always noticed when people chose silence over confrontation. It was permission, as far as he was concerned. Permission to continue. Permission to escalate. This was Derek's natural habitat spaces where money translated directly into immunity, where consequences were abstract concepts that applied to other people in other places. He'd been raised in environments like this. Country clubs where members' children could break equipment and have it blamed on staff. Private schools where disciplinary action meant a phone call to parents who wrote checks large enough to redefine the term disciplinary action. Summer homes where local laws seemed more like suggestions that could be negotiated away with the right last name and the right attorney. His father had taught him, intentionally or not, that the world operated on a simple principle. Some people matter, and some people serve. The distinction wasn't about worth or character, it was about power. And power, Derek had learned, came from knowing you could do almost anything and walk away unscathed. "Where's our server?" Tyler asked, glancing around with exaggerated impatience despite having been seated less than 5 minutes ago. "I'm starving." "You're always starving," the lean friend Josh muttered, but he was already scanning the room too, looking for someone to summon. Derek's eyes landed on Isabella before theirs did. She was 3 tables away, setting down plates with practiced efficiency. Her movements were quick but controlled, her expression pleasantly neutral in that way. Service workers perfected present but not intrusive, helpful but not familiar. She wore a blue and white uniform that looked somehow both professional and apologetic, as if the clothes themselves were designed to say, "I'm here to help. Please don't complain about me." Something about that expression, that careful neutrality, irritated Derek immediately. It reminded him of every adult who'd ever smiled while thinking he was a spoiled brat, every teacher who'd passed him despite mediocre work, because failing a Murray would create complications nobody wanted. Every service worker who'd swallowed insults because keeping their job meant tolerating his behavior. That smile wasn't respect. It was fear pretending to be politeness. And Derek had always enjoyed testing where politeness ended and fear began. "That one," he said, gesturing toward Isabella with his whiskey glass. "She looks competent, probably actually gives a shit about her job." Tyler followed his gaze and snorted. "For now. Give her 5 more years in this place and she'll look like every other dead-eyed server who hates their life." "Depressing," Josh added, though he was grinning. "Accurate, but depressing." Isabella finished with her table and turned toward the kitchen, her path bringing her directly past their booth. Derek watched her approach, noting the slight fatigue in her posture that she was trying to hide, the way her smile had become a permanent fixture rather than a genuine expression. She probably practiced that smile in the mirror, probably told herself it was professional, probably believed that if she just kept her head down and worked hard enough, things would eventually get better. Derek had seen that hope before. He'd watched it die in people. "Excuse me," he called out as she passed, his tone hovering somewhere between polite and mocking. "Think we could get some service sometime tonight? Or are we supposed to just starve while you take care of everyone else first?" Isabella stopped, turned, and deployed that careful smile with impressive speed. "Of course. I'm so sorry for the wait. Someone will be right with you, this isn't my section. But let me find your server." "Why can't you just take our order?" Derek pressed, leaning forward slightly. "You're here. We're here. Seems efficient. I'd be happy to, but your server will have your table in their system, and—" "Jesus. It's not that complicated," Tyler interrupted, laughing. "We want food. You bring food. That's literally the entire job description." Isabella's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Let me grab some menus and We don't need menus," Derek said, his voice taking on an edge of amusement. "We've been here before. Just bring us the steak medium rare and another round of drinks. Think you can handle that without a manual?" There was a pause. Brief, barely noticeable to anyone not paying attention, but Derek was paying attention. He saw the moment Isabella calculated whether pushing back would cost her more than complying would. Saw her choose compliance. Saw her swallow whatever she actually wanted to say and replace it with agreement. "Of course," she said, her voice remaining professionally pleasant. 3 steaks, medium rare, and another round. "I'll put that in right away." "Appreciate it," Derek said, his tone making it clear appreciation had nothing to do with it. Isabella nodded and walked toward the kitchen, her pace just slightly faster than before. Derek watched her go, then turned back to his friends with a satisfied grin. "See?" he said, taking another sip of whiskey. "Easy." Behind him, unnoticed and unacknowledged, the man in the black suit at the next booth set down his drink with deliberate care. Kevin Manella's expression hadn't changed, but his attention had sharpened considerably. Kevin Manella had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones nobody was watching. He sat alone in the booth directly behind Derek and his friends, positioned at an angle that gave him a clear view of the entire dining room without requiring him to turn his head. The black suit he wore was expensive, but understated, tailored perfectly to his frame. No tie. The collar of his dark shirt opened just enough to reveal the edge of ink that disappeared beneath the fabric. Tattoos that told stories he didn't share with strangers. Stories that didn't need to be shared. Because the people who needed to know already did. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers relaxed but not careless. No fidgeting, no unnecessary movement. The kind of stillness that came from years of understanding that every gesture communicated something, and silence often communicated more than words ever could. A half-finished bourbon sat within easy reach, the ice melting slowly into amber liquid he wasn't particularly interested in drinking. He'd ordered it because sitting in a restaurant without ordering created attention, and attention was something Kevin managed carefully. The drink was a prop. The solitude was intentional. He'd come here tonight because he'd needed to be somewhere that wasn't home, wasn't work, wasn't connected to the network of obligations and expectations that defined most of his life. Somewhere he could sit quietly and think without being interrupted. Somewhere he could be just another customer in an expensive suit, unremarkable and unbothered. That plan had lasted approximately 15 minutes. Kevin had noticed Derek and his friends the moment they'd entered. It was impossible not to. They'd brought a different energy into the room, the kind that announced itself through volume and posture, rather than words. Young men who'd been taught that the world would accommodate them, and so far, the world had proven that lesson correct. He'd seen 1,000 versions of Derek Murray over the years. Different faces, different names, same fundamental belief, that power meant never having to consider consequences, that respect was something purchased rather than earned, that people who served them were somehow less real than people who sat beside them. Kevin had been raised differently. His father, a man whose name still carried weight in certain circles, though he'd been dead for over a decade, had taught him that respect was currency, but only if it flowed in both directions. That a man who couldn't control himself in small moments would eventually lose control in larger ones. That how you treated people when you had power over them revealed everything about who you actually were. Those lessons had been delivered quietly, often without words, through observation, through example, through the careful way his father had moved through rooms where violence was always an option but rarely the first choice. Kevin had inherited that approach. He didn't announce himself, didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew what his last name meant, what his presence implied, and why underestimating his silence was a mistake most people only made once. Tonight, he'd been content to remain unnoticed. Just another customer. Just another man having a quiet drink while the world moved around him. Then he'd heard Derek speak to Isabella, and something in his chest had tightened with familiar recognition. It wasn't the words themselves, they'd been relatively benign on the surface. It was the tone beneath them. The casual cruelty wrapped in politeness. The way Derek had watched her calculate whether resisting would cost more than complying. The satisfaction in his expression when she'd chosen compliance. Kevin knew that dynamic intimately. He'd witnessed it his entire life. Had seen it play out in back rooms of restaurants his family had frequented. In social clubs where people with money treated people without it like animated furniture. In business dealings where power imbalances were leveraged for entertainment rather than necessity. He'd also learned, through years of experience, that men like Derek rarely stopped at verbal disrespect. They tested boundaries constantly, pushing incrementally to see how far they could go before someone pushed back. And in environments like this where staff were trained to absorb disrespect as part of their job description, those boundaries stretched further than they should. Kevin took a slow sip of his bourbon, the liquid barely registering as it passed his lips. His eyes tracked Isabella as she moved toward the kitchen, noting the tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, the way her stride had quickened just slightly. She was good at hiding it. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But Kevin had spent years reading body language the way other people read newspapers. She was rattled. Not devastated, not panicked, but unsettled in a way that would follow her through the rest of her shift. Behind him, Derek's laughter erupted again, followed by his friends joining in. They were enjoying themselves, completely unaware that their behavior had registered as anything other than normal interaction. Probably didn't even remember the exchange 30 seconds after it had ended. That was the problem with men like Derek. The damage they caused was recreational, forgettable, something they did to pass time between more important moments in their more important lives. Kevin set his glass down with deliberate care. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he'd learned to control years ago. What he felt was colder, more focused, a clarity that came from recognizing a pattern and deciding whether or not to interrupt it. Not every situation required intervention. Kevin had walked away from countless moments of casual cruelty because inserting himself would have created more problems than it solved, because some battles weren't his to fight, because sometimes the cost of action outweighed the benefit. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way Isabella had swallowed her dignity so automatically, as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. Maybe it was Derek's complete lack of awareness that he'd done anything wrong. Maybe it was the room's collective decision to ignore what had just happened, to let it dissolve into the ambient noise of normal restaurant operation. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Kevin was just tired of watching people like Derek move through the world without ever being reminded that their actions had weight. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his position so he had a better view of Derek's booth. Not obvious, not aggressive, just aware. His hands remained flat on the table, relaxed and ready. Kevin didn't know yet whether he'd need to do anything. Didn't know if Derek would escalate or if the evening would proceed without further incident. But he was watching now, and unlike everyone else in the restaurant who'd witnessed that exchange and chosen to look away, Kevin Manella had decided not to turn his attention elsewhere. He'd decided to wait, to observe, and if necessary, when necessary, to remind everyone in this room that silence wasn't neutral, it was a choice, and tonight, Kevin was choosing differently. Isabella moved through the kitchen doors with practiced efficiency, the familiar chaos of the back of house wrapping around her like a second skin she'd learned to wear comfortably. The heat hit immediately oppressive and thick, carrying the scent of searing meat, caramelizing onions, and the sharp tang of wine reducing in copper pans. Chefs called out orders in shorthand that had taken her months to decode. Pans clattered against burners. Knives struck cutting boards in rapid percussion. Someone cursed in Spanish. Someone else laughed. The kitchen operated at a volume and intensity that the dining room's carefully maintained elegance worked hard to pretend didn't exist. She found the ticket station and punched in Derek's order, her fingers moving across the screen automatically while her mind remained partially elsewhere. The interaction replayed itself without her permission. His tone, his friend's laughter, the calculation she'd made in that brief pause before responding. It wasn't the worst thing a customer had ever said to her, not even close, but something about it had landed differently tonight. Maybe she was just tired. 6 hours on her feet with 2 more to go. Rent due in a week. A car that needed inspection she couldn't afford. The accumulation of small stresses that made every additional disrespect feel heavier than it should. "You good?" The voice belonged to Marcus, one of the line cooks who'd worked here longer than Isabella had been alive. He was watching her with the kind of casual concern that came from seeing the same exhaustion in 100 different faces over the years. "Yeah," Isabella said automatically, forcing brightness into her voice. "Just another Friday night." Marcus nodded, already turning back to his station, accepting her lie because pushing further would have required time neither of them had. The kitchen didn't allow for extended emotional processing. "You moved, or you drowned." Isabella grabbed the tray she'd prepared earlier, 3 drinks destined for table 12, and pushed back through the swinging doors into the dining room's controlled atmosphere. The temperature dropped immediately. The noise softened. The lighting dimmed from harsh fluorescent to warm amber. 2 different worlds separated by 8 inches of steel and wood. She delivered the drinks with mechanical precision, accepted thanks she barely registered, and turned toward the bar to collect the round Derek had ordered. Another whiskey. Another overpriced beer, something with vodka that Tyler had specified by brand as if it mattered. The bartender Jordan, efficient and perpetually exhausted, had them ready before she arrived. "Table 6?" he asked, though he already knew. "Yeah, those kids tipping you?" Isabella shrugged. "Probably. Eventually. After they've made it clear they're doing me a favor." Jordan's expression suggested he'd dealt with customers like Derek before, and hadn't enjoyed it any more than she was. "Let me know if they get worse. I can water down their drinks until they're basically paying $12 for ice." The offer made her smile genuinely for the first time in an hour. Tempting. She loaded the drinks onto her tray with careful precision, 3 glasses, specific placement, weight distributed evenly. The tray itself was heavy even before adding liquid. After 6 hours, it felt like carrying concrete. Her right shoulder had developed a chronic ache that no amount of stretching ever fully resolved. Physical therapy wasn't covered by the insurance the restaurant provided, and paying out of pocket meant choosing between healing and eating. She'd chosen eating. Isabella lifted the tray with practiced ease, the motion so automatic her body executed it without conscious thought. One hand beneath for support, the other steadying the edge. Weight balanced across her forearm and shoulder. 3 steps to test stability before committing to the full walk. The dining room stretched before her, a obstacle course of tables, chairs, and customers she'd navigate without incident because she always did. Muscle memory guided her around table 9, past the elderly couple at 11, through the narrow gap between the bar and booth 7, where a businessman sat alone, typing on a laptop while his food grew cold. Derek's booth sat directly ahead, positioned along the main aisle where foot traffic was highest. Deliberate placement. Maximum visibility. She could see them from here, Tyler scrolling through his phone. Josh leaning back with casual arrogance. Derek himself gesturing broadly while telling some story that had made him laugh at his own punchline. She was 12 feet away when she noticed Kevin Manella for the first time. Not because he'd done anything to attract attention, the opposite, actually. He sat so still in the booth beside Derek's that he'd become almost invisible despite his size and presence. But something about that stillness made him suddenly visible to her, the way a predator becomes noticeable the moment you realize it's been watching you the entire time. He was looking directly at Derek's table, not glancing, not casually observing, looking, with the kind of focus that suggested he was cataloging information, rather than simply passing time. Isabella's attention lingered on him for perhaps 2 seconds, noting the black suit, the tattoos visible at his collar and wrists, the way his hands rested on the table with unsettling calm, before her training reasserted itself and she looked away. Customers who wanted privacy deserved privacy. Staring was unprofessional. She was 8 feet from Derek's booth when Tyler noticed her approaching. "Finally," he announced, loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Thought maybe you got lost." "Sorry for the wait," Isabella replied automatically, the apology emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak. Years of conditioning. Apologize first. Think later. 6 feet away, Derek turned to look at her, his expression already amused by something only he understood. He said something to Josh that Isabella couldn't quite hear, but both of them laughed in response. The kind of laugh that preceded entertainment at someone else's expense. 4 feet. Isabella's focus narrowed to pure execution. Don't spill, don't stumble, don't give them any reason to complain. The tray felt heavier than it should, her shoulder burning with familiar strain. Almost there. 3 feet. Derek shifted in his seat, his body language suggesting he was preparing to say something. Probably another comment delivered with that particular tone that made insults sound like conversation. She'd smile through it. Deliver the drinks. Walk away. 2 feet. That's when Derek's leg moved. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just a subtle extension into the aisle, his foot crossing from beneath the table into the narrow path Isabella needed to traverse. Casual. Deliberate. Deniable. She saw it at the last possible second. Her brain registered the obstruction and sent emergency signals to muscles already committed to forward motion. Her body tried to adjust, tried to compensate, tried to execute the kind of last-minute correction that might have worked if she'd been carrying nothing, if she hadn't been on her feet for 6 hours, if her reflexes hadn't been dulled by exhaustion. But she was carrying 12 pounds of glass and liquid. And she had been on her feet for 6 hours, and her reflexes were dulled. Isabella's foot caught Derek's ankle with enough force to break her stride completely. Time fractured. Her forward momentum continued while her lower body stopped abruptly. The tray tilted. Her hand gripped tighter, instinctively trying to save what was already lost. Weight shifted catastrophically. 3 glasses began sliding in 3 different directions, liquid sloshing over edges, gravity asserting itself with indifferent finality. She felt herself falling, felt her knee strike the floor with brutal impact, felt the tray slip from her grasp despite every desperate attempt to hold it. Then came the sound. Glass shattering against wood, liquid splashing across polished floor. The sharp, crystalline crash that cut through conversation and music and ambient noise like a gunshot in a library. The entire restaurant went silent. Isabella knelt on the floor in a spreading pool of whiskey, beer, and vodka, surrounded by shattered glass, her uniform soaked, her knee screaming, her face burning with humiliation so profound it felt physical. And above her, Derek Murray began to laugh. The laughter came first, loud, unrestrained, and sharp enough to cut through the silence that had frozen the restaurant in place. Derek's hand shot out, finger pointing directly at Isabella as she knelt on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and spreading liquid. His mouth opened wide with genuine amusement, the kind of laughter that came from deep in the chest, uninhibited by self-awareness or empathy. He wasn't trying to be quiet, wasn't trying to be subtle. He was enjoying this too much to care who heard. "Oh my God," he managed between breaths, his voice carrying across the dining room with perfect clarity. "Did you see that?" He gestured wildly, miming a stumbling motion that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. "Just completely ate it." Tyler erupted beside him, his stocky frame shaking with laughter as he slapped the table hard enough to make their remaining glasses jump. "Dude, that was incredible. Like watching someone fail in slow motion." Josh leaned forward, grinning as he pulled out his phone. Please tell me someone got that on video. That was comedy gold. Their laughter fed off each other, building in volume and confidence. Other customers had turned to look, some with surprise, others with uncomfortable curiosity, but no one said anything. The moment hung suspended in collective uncertainty, everyone waiting to see how this would resolve itself, hoping someone else would take responsibility for responding. Isabella remained frozen on her knees, her hands pressed against the wet floor, her breathing shallow and quick. The physical impact had been jarring. Her knee had struck the hardwood with enough force that pain was radiating up her thigh in hot, nauseating waves. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the other kind, the kind that came from being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The kind that made your face burn and your throat close and your vision narrow until all you could see was the mess you were kneeling in, the mess you'd somehow become responsible for despite not having caused it. Glass glittered around her like malicious diamonds. Amber liquid soaked through the fabric of her uniform, cold against her skin. She could smell the whiskey, sharp and astringent, could feel dozens of eyes on her back, could hear Derek's laughter echoing in her skull like a taunt that would never fully fade. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say, the words automatic and pathetic. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean this up right away. I'm so sorry?" Derek interrupted, still laughing. "You should be. Do you know how much those drinks cost? That's like $50 on the floor right there." "Probably comes out of her paycheck," Tyler added, grinning. "Guess you're working for free tonight, huh?" Josh laughed at that, shaking his head. "Brutal." Isabella's hands trembled as she began reaching for the larger pieces of glass, trying to gather them despite having no plan for where to put them, no tray to collect them on. No clear thought beyond needing to fix this immediately. A shard cut into her palm, not deep, but enough to draw a thin line of blood that mixed with the alcohol on her hands. She barely felt it. "Careful," Derek said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. That would be—" He paused for effect, glancing at his friends. "Oh wait, you already did that yourself." More laughter. Isabella's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let tears form, refusing to give them that satisfaction. She'd cry later. In her car. In her apartment. Somewhere private where humiliation could be processed without an audience. But not here. Not now. Not in front of them. "Someone should help her," a woman's voice said from a nearby table, quiet and uncertain. "Someone should teach her to watch where she's walking." Derek shot back immediately, loud enough to ensure everyone heard. "Seriously, how do you trip over nothing? Were you texting? Were you drunk?" "I wasn't," Isabella started, then stopped. Because what was the point? Defending herself would only extend this moment, would only give them more ammunition, would only make everything worse. The manager appeared then, materializing from wherever managers disappeared to when things were running smoothly. Richard was in his 50s, professionally pleasant, and fundamentally allergic to confrontation with customers who spent money. He looked at the mess, at Isabella still kneeling in it, at Derek and his friends clearly enjoying themselves, and made a calculation that Isabella recognized immediately. This would be her fault. "Isabella," Richard said, his tone carefully neutral but edged with disappointment. "Are you hurt?" "No," she lied automatically. "I'm fine. What happened?" Before she could answer, Derek leaned forward, his expression shifting to something resembling concern that didn't reach his eyes. "She just wasn't paying attention, man. Came flying past our table and totally wiped out. We were about to check if she was okay, but—" He gestured at the mess with exaggerated helplessness. The lie was so casual, so confident, that for a moment Isabella almost doubted her own memory. Almost wondered if maybe she had been careless, had been moving too fast, had simply missed seeing her own feet. Then she remembered the deliberate extension of his leg, the calculation in his eyes, the smile that had preceded her fall. "I tripped," she said quietly, not looking at Derek, not accusing him directly because she knew how that would sound. A server blaming a customer. Her word against his expensive clothes and confident friends versus her soaked uniform and bleeding palm. There was no universe where that ended in her favor. "Let's get this cleaned up," Richard said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Isabella, go to the back and get yourself together. I'll have someone bring out their replacement drinks and comp their meal." "Appreciated," Derek said smoothly, leaning back in his booth with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won a game they'd invented. "Accidents happen, right? No hard feelings?" Tyler snickered. Josh raised his phone slightly, checking an angle. Isabella pushed herself to her feet, her knee protesting with sharp insistence. Her uniform clung to her body, cold and uncomfortable. Her hands were shaking. Her face felt like it was on fire. She turned toward the kitchen without making eye contact with anyone, walking as quickly as her injured knee would allow, desperate to be anywhere else, to be invisible again, to have this moment erase itself from existence. Behind her, Derek's laughter started up again, quieter now but still audible, still victorious. The dining room gradually resumed its previous rhythm. Conversations picked back up. Silverware clinked against plates. The jazz music that had been temporarily drowned out reasserted itself. Within 90 seconds, the incident had been absorbed into the restaurant's normal operation. A minor disruption, a momentary awkwardness, nothing that would be remembered past tonight, except by Isabella, who would remember it forever, and by Kevin Manella, who hadn't moved from his booth, who hadn't looked away, whose hands had slowly curled into fists against the table, whose expression had shifted from observation to decision. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Isabella with a soft pneumatic hiss, cutting her off from the dining room and its carefully maintained illusions. She made it exactly 6 steps before her composure shattered. Her back hit the cold tile wall beside the dry storage area, away from the main kitchen line where the cooks worked, away from the dish pit where servers congregated between tables, away from anyone who might see what was happening to her face. Her hand pressed against her mouth, trying to hold back the sound threatening to escape her throat, not quite a sob, but something rawer and more desperate. The tears came anyway. They burned behind her eyes, spilled over despite her best efforts, tracked hot lines down cheeks that still felt flushed with humiliation. Her whole body was shaking now that no one could see it. The adrenaline that had kept her upright finally draining away and leaving nothing but exhaustion and shame in its wake. Her knee throbbed with each heartbeat. Her palm stung where the glass had cut it. Her uniform stuck to her skin, cold and uncomfortable, reeking of alcohol. But none of that compared to the feeling sitting like concrete in her chest, the weight of public humiliation, of injustice that couldn't be challenged, of dignity stripped away while people watched and chose to do nothing. She'd tripped over his foot. She knew it, had felt the contact, had seen his leg extended into the aisle at the last possible second. It hadn't been an accident. Hadn't been her carelessness. He'd done it deliberately, for entertainment, because he could, and no one had said anything. The customers who'd watched had looked away within seconds. The manager had blamed her by implication, focusing on her carelessness rather than questioning what had actually happened. Derek had lied smoothly, confidently, secure in the knowledge that his version of events would be accepted over hers because his clothes cost more, and his friends laughed at his jokes and his presence in this restaurant meant revenue. Isabella pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to physically push the tears back in, trying to restore some semblance of control. She needed to clean herself up. Needed to change if she had a spare shirt in her locker. She didn't. Needed to get back out there because she had 4 other tables and they'd still expect service and tips didn't earn themselves. The injustice of it all made her chest ache. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been working, doing her job, moving through space. She navigated 100 times every shift. And in less than 5 seconds, someone had decided to hurt her for fun, and the entire world had agreed that this was somehow her fault. "You okay?" The voice made her jump. Maria, another server, stood a few feet away with an expression of genuine concern that somehow made Isabella feel worse rather than better. Pity was harder to receive than indifference. "Yeah," Isabella managed, her voice rough and unconvincing. "Just need a minute." Maria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I saw what happened. That kid's an asshole." The validation should have helped. Instead, it just highlighted how meaningless validation was when no one with power shared it. Maria had seen. Maybe others had too, but seeing didn't matter if no one was willing to say something when it counted. "Doesn't matter," Isabella said, wiping her face with the back of her hand and wincing when she remembered the cut on her palm. "Richard's comping their meal. They probably won't even tip now. They wouldn't have tipped anyway," Maria said darkly. "Rich kids never do. They think their presence is the tip." Isabella pushed off from the wall, testing her knee's stability. It protested but held. "I need to get back out there." "You're soaked." "I know. Richard should send you home. Workers' comp or something." "Richard's not sending me home," Isabella said flatly, because they both knew how this worked. Sending her home meant being understaffed during Friday dinner service, meant the other servers picking up her tables and resenting the extra work, meant losing hours she couldn't afford to lose. "I'll dry." Maria looked like she wanted to argue but didn't. She'd worked here long enough to understand that fairness was a luxury, not a right. You want me to take your section for a bit? No. Isabella straightened her uniform as best she could, finger combing her hair back into place. But thanks. She walked toward the bathroom to at least wash her hands and face, each step sending dull pain through her knee. The fluorescent lighting in the narrow hallway made everything look harsh and overexposed. She caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized herself. Eyes red, makeup smeared, uniform disaster, expression somewhere between fury and defeat. This wasn't who she'd thought she'd be at 26. She'd had plans once. College, maybe. A career that involved sitting down occasionally. Dignity, respect. The normal things people hoped for when they thought about their futures. But plans required money. And money required work. And work, for people without connections or safety nets, meant places like this. Meant swallowing disrespect. Meant accepting that your version of events didn't matter as much as someone else's. Meant learning that silence was the price of survival. Isabella washed her hands carefully, hissing when soap hit the cut on her palm. She dried her face, fixed her makeup as best she could with shaking hands, and stared at her reflection for a long moment. You did nothing wrong, she whispered to herself, testing the words, hoping repetition might make them feel true. They didn't. She pushed back out into the kitchen, past the line cooks who pretended not to notice her red eyes, past the dishwashers who'd seen this same scene play out with different servers a dozen times before. The dining room doors loomed ahead, the barrier between this world and that one, between who she had to be back here and who she had to pretend to be out there. Isabella took a breath, squared her shoulders, and pushed through. The dining room's atmosphere hadn't changed. Conversations continued at their usual volume. Glasses clinked, soft music played. The spot where she'd fallen had already been cleaned, no evidence remained of what had happened. As if erasing the physical mess meant erasing the incident itself. Derek and his friends were still in their booth, laughing about something on Josh's phone. They didn't look up when she emerged, didn't acknowledge her existence. Why would they? She'd already served her purpose as momentary entertainment. Now she was nothing again. Isabella returned to her section, checking on table 7 with mechanical professionalism. The elderly couple smiled at her kindly, asked if she was all right, offered sympathy that felt genuine but couldn't change anything. She assured them she was fine, took their dessert order, moved on. Table 9 needed water refills. Table 12 wanted their check. Table 14 had questions about the menu she'd answered 500 times before. She moved through it all on autopilot, her body executing tasks while her mind remained partially elsewhere. Still kneeling on that floor, still hearing that laughter, still feeling the weight of collective silence that had taught her exactly how little she mattered. At the booth beside Derek's table, Kevin Manella sat perfectly still. His bourbon remained untouched. His hands remained flat on the table. His expression remained unchanged, but something in the set of his jaw had shifted. Something in the focus of his eyes had sharpened. Something in the deliberate control of his breathing suggested a decision had been made. He'd watched Isabella disappear into the kitchen, had watched the staff clean up the mess, had watched Derek and his friends celebrate their victory with continued laughter and zero consequences, had watched the entire restaurant collectively decide this was normal, acceptable, not worth intervention. Kevin had seen this pattern his entire life, had seen countless moments where cruelty went unchallenged because challenging it was uncomfortable, because the victim had less power than the aggressor, because silence was easier than action. He'd walked away from most of those moments, had told himself they weren't his responsibility, that inserting himself would create complications, that the world was full of injustice he couldn't personally fix, but tonight felt different. Maybe because he'd watched Isabella's face as she'd apologized for something that wasn't her fault. Maybe because Derek's laughter had contained the particular satisfaction of someone who knew he'd get away with it. Maybe because Kevin was tired of being part of the silence that made moments like this possible. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he'd just decided this was the moment he stopped looking away. Kevin's hands slowly curled into loose fists. Then, with deliberate calm, he stood up. Kevin rose from his seat with the kind of slowness that suggested perfect control. No sudden movements, no aggression, just a man standing up in a restaurant. But something about the way he moved made the nearest tables notice. Maybe it was his size, more apparent now that he was vertical, tall, broad-shouldered, filling space with presence rather than noise. Maybe it was the deliberate quality of his movements, the way someone who'd spent years controlling violence moved differently than someone who'd never needed to. Or maybe it was something less tangible, something primal in the way certain predators announce themselves without making a sound. Whatever it was, conversations at adjacent tables faltered mid-sentence. Kevin adjusted his suit jacket with practiced ease, the fabric settling perfectly across his frame. The tattoos at his collar and wrists were more visible now, dark ink that disappeared beneath expensive cloth, symbols and words that told stories to people who knew how to read them. His face remained neutral, almost pleasant, but his eyes had taken on a quality that made looking directly at them uncomfortable. He took one step toward Derek's booth. The laughter died immediately. Derek noticed him first, his peripheral vision catching the movement, his brain registering that someone large was approaching their table with purpose. His smile faltered, replaced by confusion that hadn't yet evolved into concern. Tyler and Josh followed his gaze, their own expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. "Can we help you?" Derek asked, his tone still carrying traces of the confidence that had defined his entire evening. The words came out casual, almost dismissive, the way someone speaks when they're not yet aware they should be worried. Kevin stopped at the edge of their booth, standing close enough to cast a shadow across their table. He didn't lean forward aggressively, didn't raise his voice, didn't make any gesture that could be interpreted as threatening. He simply looked at Derek with the kind of attention that made it clear this wasn't a casual conversation. When Kevin spoke, his voice was quiet, barely above normal, speaking volume, but it carried through the space with perfect clarity. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it assumed it would be heard. "You tripped her." 3 words. Statement, not question. Derek blinked, his brain taking a moment to process both the accusation and the fact that someone was making it. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Excuse me?" "The waitress," Kevin continued, his tone remaining perfectly even. "The one who fell about 5 minutes ago. You stuck your foot out. I watched you do it." The booth went silent. Tyler's hand froze halfway to his phone. Josh's smile evaporated completely. Derek's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, then irritation that someone was challenging his version of events. "I don't know what you think you saw," Derek said, his voice taking on a defensive edge wrapped in false politeness. "But she tripped over her own feet. It was an accident." "Maybe you should mind your own. I saw you extend your leg into the aisle," Kevin interrupted, his tone still calm but carrying an undercurrent of finality that made interrupting him feel dangerous. "I watched you position it deliberately. I saw you smile before she fell. And I heard you laugh after." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Derek's face flushed, not with shame, but with anger at being called out. He straightened in his seat, puffing up slightly the way young men did when they felt their authority questioned. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but Kevin Manella." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. For a moment, nothing happened. Derek stared at Kevin with continued defiance, clearly expecting the name to mean nothing, to be just another attempt at intimidation that he could brush off the way he'd brushed off every adult authority figure who'd ever tried to correct his behavior. Then recognition flickered across Tyler's face. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. His posture shifted from relaxed confidence to rigid attention. He glanced at Derek with an expression that suggested he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to say it in front of company. Josh caught the change in Tyler's demeanor and his own expression began to shift, uncertainty creeping in where smugness had been seconds before. Derek noticed their reactions and his irritation deepened. "Am I supposed to know who that is?" Tyler leaned closer, lowering his voice to an urgent whisper that Kevin could still hear perfectly. "Dude. Manella. That Manella." The color drained from Derek's face in stages, first pink fading to pale, then pale fading to something closer to gray. His mouth went dry enough that Kevin could see him swallow reflexively. The confident posture collapsed inward as his brain made connections it should have made immediately if he'd been paying attention to anything beyond his own entertainment. Kevin waited, watching the realization settle with the patience of someone who'd had this exact conversation before. He knew the precise moment Derek understood not just who Kevin was, but what that name meant. What family it represented, what world it came from, what consequences it implied. "I didn't," Derek started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "It was just a joke. She's fine. No one got hurt." "She's bleeding," Kevin said quietly. "Her knee hit the floor hard enough that she's limping. Her uniform is soaked. And she apologized to you for something you did to her. So let's not pretend no one got hurt." Derek's friends had gone completely silent, their earlier bravado evaporating like water on hot pavement. They'd both shifted subtly away from Derek, creating physical distance that suggested they were reconsidering their association with whatever was happening. The surrounding tables had gone quiet too. Not obviously, people were still pretending to eat, still going through the motions of normal restaurant behavior, but conversations had softened to whispers. Eyes watched without making direct contact. Everyone in the immediate area was aware that something significant was unfolding, even if they didn't understand exactly what. Kevin let the silence stretch, let Derek's discomfort build, let the weight of attention and expectation settle over the booth like a physical presence. Then he leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance, just enough to make this conversation more intimate and more inescapable. "Here's what's going to happen," Kevin said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Derek to strain to hear every word. "You're going to sit here and think very carefully about what you did tonight, about how it felt to make someone else small so you could feel big, about whether that's the kind of man you want to be." I'm not finished," Kevin said, and Derek's mouth snapped shut immediately. "You're going to leave a tip that reflects an actual apology, not 10%, not 20%, something that makes it clear you understand what you did was wrong, and then you're going to leave this restaurant quietly, without another word to anyone who works here." Derek nodded quickly, desperately eager to agree to anything that would end this conversation. "And if I ever hear that you've done something like this again," Kevin continued, his tone remaining conversational but his eyes going cold in a way that made his meaning unmistakable, "we're going to have a much longer conversation. The kind that doesn't happen in public. Do you understand?" "Yes," Derek whispered. "Yes, I understand." Kevin straightened, his expression softening back to something approaching neutral. He adjusted his cuffs with casual precision, taking his time, making it clear he wasn't being rushed or dismissed. "Good," he said simply. Then he turned and walked back to his booth with the same deliberate calm he'd approached with, leaving Derek and his friends sitting in stunned silence. The restaurant remained frozen for several heartbeats. Then, gradually, sound returned. Conversations resumed. Silverware clinked. The moment absorbed itself back into the normal rhythm of Friday evening service, but everything had changed. Derek stared at the table, his face still pale, his hands trembling slightly. His friends said nothing, and Kevin Manella sat back down, picked up his bourbon, and took a slow sip. His expression revealed nothing, but anyone watching closely would have noticed the faintest suggestion of satisfaction in his eyes. Kevin sat down in his booth with the same measured calm he'd approached Derek's table with, his movements suggesting the conversation had required no more energy than ordering dessert. He didn't look back, didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way silence had replaced Derek's earlier laughter, the way nearby tables had stopped pretending they weren't paying attention, the way the entire restaurant had collectively held its breath and was only now beginning to exhale. His bourbon sat exactly where he'd left it, the ice mostly melted, the liquid diluted past the point of being worth drinking. He took a sip anyway, more for the ritual than the taste, giving Derek and his friends time to process what had just happened without the pressure of continued observation. Behind him, he heard the scrape of a booth bench, whispered conversation, too quiet to make out words, but urgent enough that the tone carried. The rustle of a wallet being retrieved, bills being counted with shaking hands. Kevin set his glass down and finally allowed himself to glance back. Derek was standing now, his face still pale, his earlier confidence completely absent. He placed several bills on the table. Kevin couldn't see the denomination from this angle, but the stack was thick enough to suggest Derek had understood the assignment. Tyler and Josh were already on their feet, hovering near the booth's edge with the nervous energy of people desperate to leave but unsure if they had permission. No one was laughing. No one was making jokes. No one was meeting anyone else's eyes. Derek moved toward the exit with quick, stiff steps, his friends following close behind like they were afraid being separated might somehow make things worse. They didn't stop at the host stand, didn't acknowledge the staff, didn't look at any of the customers who'd witnessed their humiliation. The door opened, admitting a brief gust of cool evening air, then closed behind them with a soft chime that felt inappropriately cheerful given the circumstances. They were gone. The restaurant exhaled collectively, conversations resuming with slightly more energy than before, as if people needed to re-establish normalcy after witnessing something that had disrupted the usual social order. Within 30 seconds, the dining room had absorbed Derek's departure the same way it had absorbed Isabella's fall, as a temporary disruption that could be smoothed over and forgotten. But not everyone was ready to forget. Kevin watched as Richard, the manager, approached Derek's now empty booth with the cautious energy of someone who'd just realized they might have mishandled something important. He picked up the bills Derek had left. Kevin saw his eyebrows rise at whatever amount he was holding, then looked around the dining room as if searching for an explanation. His gaze landed on Kevin. For a moment, their eyes met. Richard's expression cycled through confusion, uncertainty, and then careful neutrality as his brain made whatever connections it needed to make. He gave Kevin a small nod, acknowledgement without commitment, respect without understanding, then walked away toward the kitchen with the money still in his hand. Kevin returned his attention to his bourbon, content to let Richard's speculation remain just that. He hadn't intervened for recognition or gratitude, hadn't done it to make a statement about himself. He'd done it because someone needed to, and everyone else had chosen not to. Simple as that. The kitchen doors swung open, and Isabella emerged carrying a tray of desserts destined for a table across the dining room. She moved carefully, still favoring her uninjured leg slightly, her uniform mostly dry now but wrinkled from the earlier disaster. Her face had regained some composure, the professional mask back in place, though Kevin could still see traces of strain around her eyes. She didn't know yet what had happened at Derek's table. Didn't know he'd left. Didn't know about the money he'd been forced to leave behind or the fear Kevin had put in his voice. She would find out eventually from Richard, probably, or from one of the other servers who'd witnessed the confrontation. But for now, she simply moved through the dining room doing her job, carrying weight she shouldn't have to carry, maintaining dignity that others had tried to strip from her. Kevin watched her deliver the desserts with practiced efficiency, watched her smile at customers who had no idea what she'd been through tonight, watched her disappear back into the kitchen without once glancing toward the booth where Derek had been sitting. She was stronger than Derek would ever be. Stronger than most people in this room, actually. Strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up when the world had given you every reason to stay down. Kevin pulled out his wallet and placed enough cash on his table to cover his bill, plus a tip that would raise eyebrows. Not because he wanted recognition, but because people like Isabella deserved more than they typically received from people like him. He stood, adjusted his jacket one final time, and walked toward the exit without fanfare or announcement. A few heads turned as he passed. People who'd witnessed the confrontation with Derek and were now watching to see if anything else would happen. Nothing else would happen. Kevin pushed through the door into the cool evening air, the sounds of the restaurant fading behind him as the door swung shut. The street outside was busy with Friday night energy couples walking to bars, groups laughing on corners, cars passing with music bleeding through closed windows. Normal life, normal people, normal problems. Kevin started walking, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, his mind already moving past tonight's events toward tomorrow's obligations. He'd done what needed doing. Now it was done. Behind him, inside the restaurant, Richard stood at Derek's table staring at $500 in cash left as penance for a crime the official record would claim never happened. And in the kitchen, Maria was pulling Isabella aside, her voice urgent and excited as she explained what had just occurred, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to share what everyone was already talking about. Isabella listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something else, something fragile and tentative that looked almost like hope. Isabella stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support, listening to Maria describe what had happened with an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure she was hearing correctly. "I'm serious," Maria insisted, her voice low but intense. This guy just stood up and walked over to their table like he owned the place. Didn't yell, didn't threaten, just talked to them. And Derek looked like he was going to pass out. "What did he say?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't hear all of it, but I heard him say your name. Said Derek tripped you on purpose. Called him out right there in front of everyone." Maria's eyes were bright with vicarious satisfaction. You should have seen Derek's face when he realized who he was talking to. Went white as a sheet. Isabella's hand moved to her chest, pressing against the ache that had been sitting there since she'd fallen. "Who was he?" "Some guy named Manella, Kevin Manella." Maria paused, watching Isabella's face for recognition. "You know who that is?" Isabella shook her head slowly. "Well, Derek sure did. Soon as he heard the name, he looked like he wanted to crawl under the table." Maria leaned closer, dropping her voice even further, left $500 on the table. $500, Isabella. For drinks they never even finished. The number didn't make sense. Isabella's brain tried to process it and came up empty. "That's not possible. Richard's holding it right now. Ask him yourself." Isabella turned to look across the kitchen where Richard stood near the office, the stack of bills still visible in his hand. He was staring at the money with an expression that suggested he was also having trouble believing what he was seeing. As if sensing her attention, Richard looked up and met her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Richard crossed the kitchen toward her, his expression unreadable, the money held carefully like it might disappear if he handled it wrong. "Isabella," he said when he reached her, his tone softer than she'd heard it all night. "This was left on table 6. He held out the bills. Isabella stared at them without reaching out, her hands remaining at her sides. "I don't understand." "It's yours," Richard said simply. The customer who intervened made it very clear this was meant as an apology for what happened. "But I didn't," Isabella started, then stopped, because what was she arguing against? That she deserved it? That Derek shouldn't have to pay for humiliating her? That accepting this money somehow made her complicit in a system she hated? Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the bills. They felt real, solid, undeniably present. $500, more than she made in a week, more than her rent, more than the car inspection she couldn't afford, more than she'd held in her hands at one time and longer than she could remember. "There's something else," Richard said, his voice gentler now, almost apologetic, "about what happened earlier." With the fall, Isabella tensed, preparing for the criticism she'd been expecting since the moment glass had shattered against the floor. "I should have asked more questions," Richard continued. "Should have made sure you were actually okay instead of just trying to smooth things over with the customers. That wasn't fair to you." The apology landed so unexpectedly that Isabella didn't know how to respond. She'd been working here for 3 years and couldn't remember Richard ever apologizing for anything. "It's fine," she said automatically, the reflex still strong despite everything that had happened tonight. "It's not fine," Richard said firmly. "But I'm going to try to do better, starting with making sure you take tomorrow off. Paid. Your knee needs rest, and you've earned it." Isabella opened her mouth to protest she needed the hours, needed the money, couldn't afford to miss a shift, but Richard raised his hand to stop her. "Paid," he repeated. "Not negotiable." Then he walked away before she could argue, leaving her standing there with $500 in one hand and a day off she hadn't asked for clutched in the other. Maria squeezed her shoulder. "You okay?" "I don't know," Isabella admitted honestly. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of surreal normalcy. Tables still needed service, orders still needed taking, customers still needed attention. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of routine. People looked at her differently with sympathy, curiosity, respect, or some combination of all three. The elderly couple from table 7 left her a $50 tip and a note that said simply, "Glad you're all right." Table 9 asked if she needed anything and actually waited for her answer. Even table 14, who'd been demanding and impatient all evening, softened their tone when asking for their check. By the time her shift ended at 11, Isabella felt hollowed out and overfull at the same time, exhausted but wired, empty but somehow more substantial than she'd been 8 hours ago. She changed out of her uniform in the employee bathroom, moving slowly to accommodate her injured knee. The cut on her palm had stopped bleeding but would probably scar. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired but not defeated. That was something. The money sat in her purse, still feeling unreal. She pushed through the back door into the parking lot where the cool night air hit her face like a benediction. Her car sat in its usual spot under the broken light that maintenance kept promising to fix. She walked toward it carefully, testing her knee with each step, finding it painful but manageable. The lot was mostly empty now, just a few employee vehicles and the manager's car near the back entrance. Isabella reached her car and was searching for her keys when she noticed something. A piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. She pulled it free, unfolding it under the dim glow of a distant streetlight. The handwriting was masculine, controlled, unfamiliar. "You did nothing wrong." No signature. No explanation. Just 5 words that somehow carried more weight than the $500 in her purse. Isabella read them twice, then a third time, her vision blurring slightly as tears she'd been holding back all night finally demanded release. She stood in the empty parking lot, paper clutched in one hand, and let herself cry not from pain or humiliation this time, but from something else. Something that felt almost like relief, like vindication, like being seen. Isabella woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her apartment window at an hour she was usually already halfway through a shift. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. Why wasn't her alarm going off? Why wasn't she exhausted? Why did her knee hurt? Then the previous night reassembled itself in her memory, piece by piece, until she was fully awake and staring at the ceiling, processing everything that had happened. The fall, the laughter, the humiliation, and then the intervention. The money, the note. "You did nothing wrong." She rolled over carefully, testing her knee's condition. Still sore, but better than last night. The kind of injury that would heal with time and rest, both of which she now had, at least for today. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark. She picked it up and found 3 text messages from Maria, sent late last night after Isabella had left. Everyone's still talking about it. Derek's friends are telling people he got thrown out by the Mafia. LOL. You're basically famous. Isabella smiled despite herself, then set the phone back down. Famous wasn't what she wanted. She just wanted to be treated with basic human decency. Apparently, that required intervention from someone powerful enough to make Derek afraid. The thought should have made her feel grateful, and part of her was grateful. Genuinely, but another part felt something more complicated. Sadness, maybe. That justice had required a man like Kevin Manella to dispense it. That her own voice, her own truth, her own experience, hadn't been enough to matter until someone with power decided to care. She got out of bed slowly, made coffee in the quiet of her small kitchen, and sat by the window watching the city wake up around her. People walking dogs, cars heading to work, normal Saturday morning rhythms that usually happened while she slept. The $500 sat on her counter where she'd placed it last night, still feeling surreal in the daylight. That money would change things. Not forever. $500 wasn't life-changing in any permanent sense, but for right now, it meant breathing room, meant getting her car inspected, meant groceries that weren't generic brand, meant 1 month where she didn't have to choose between paying rent on time or keeping the lights on. It meant dignity, purchased at the price of her humiliation. The note sat beside the money, those 5 words still carrying impossible weight. You did nothing wrong. Isabella had spent years learning to swallow blame that wasn't hers, to apologize for existing in spaces where people with power found her inconvenient. She'd internalized the lesson that survival meant accepting responsibility for things beyond her control, because fighting that current required energy she didn't have and would only result in losing her job. But someone had seen what actually happened, had cared enough to say something, had used his power not to hurt her, but to protect her. That changed something fundamental. Not in the world was still the world, full of people like Derek who believed their money made them untouchable, full of managers like Richard who prioritized comfort over justice, full of systems designed to make people like Isabella invisible. But in her, something in her had shifted. Some small, quiet part that had learned to stay silent was reconsidering whether silence was actually safety or just slow erasure. She finished her coffee, showered carefully to protect her injured knee, and got dressed in clothes that weren't her uniform. The day stretched ahead of her, empty of obligations, and she decided to do something she hadn't done in months. She went for a walk. Not anywhere specific. Just out into the city, moving at her own pace, stopping when she wanted to stop, existing in public space without serving anyone or apologizing for taking up room. People passed her on the sidewalk without incident. No one tripped her, no one laughed, no one made her feel small. It was normal, unremarkable, and somehow, after last night, it felt like a gift. By the time Isabella returned to her apartment that evening, her knee was protesting, but her mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. She made dinner, ate slowly, and sat by the window as the sun set over the city. Tomorrow she'd go back to the restaurant, back to the same job, the same customers, the same underlying dynamics that had created last night's situation in the first place, but she'd go back different. Because someone had reminded her that silence wasn't neutral, that what happened to her mattered, that she'd done nothing wrong, and believing that didn't require anyone's permission. The note still sat on her counter. Isabella picked it up one more time, read those 5 words again, then carefully folded it and placed it in her wallet where she'd see it every day. Some things were worth remembering, some voices were worth listening to, and some moments terrible as they were taught you exactly who you were and who you wanted to become. Isabella Harris had fallen last night, but she'd gotten back up, and this time, she'd stood a little taller than before. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.